I'm sure you've heard of cell membranes being described as fluid mosaics of lipids and proteins, but what exactly does this mean? The most important components of these membranes are lipids, proteins, and carbohydrates. Let's look at these building blocks separately. The most abundant lipids in most membranes are phospholipids. A phospholipid is an amphipathic molecule, meaning it has both a hydrophilic and a hydrophobic region. As you can see on this picture, it is composed of a phosphate head that attracts water and two fatty acid tails that repel water. Another lipid in the cell membrane is cholesterol, which is located in the interior of the bilayer. Its purpose is to make the membrane more fluid and flexible at lower temperatures by preventing the phospholipids from packing together so tightly. At higher temperatures, it reduces phospholipid movement to prevent the membrane from falling apart. In this fluid mosaic model, the membrane is a mosaic of proteins embedded in the fluid phospholipid bilayer. The majority of these molecules are integral and peripheral proteins. Integral proteins are found in the hydrophobic interior of the lipid bilayer and aid in the transport of materials into and out of the cell, which we will discuss later. Peripheral proteins are loosely bound to the surface of the membrane and are typically useful in aiding with a reaction within the cell. Some of these membrane proteins have carbohydrate chains called glycoproteins, which aid in cell recognition, a crucial part of the functioning of cells. Membrane carbohydrates are usually short branched chains of fewer than 15 sugar units. This wraps up our overview of the cell membrane structure, and we will now take a look at the transport of materials into and out of the cell. The hydrophobic interior and hydrophilic exterior of the cell membrane cause it to exhibit selective permeability. In other words, the membrane only allows certain materials to cross it easily. Substances can enter and leave the cell by passive and active transport. Passive transport requires no energy. Diffusion is a type of passive transport, where matter moves into or out of the cell along a concentration gradient. Molecules diffuse toward areas of lower concentration so that they can ultimately become evenly distributed. Small, non-polar molecules will be able to cross the membrane without any help, but larger or polar molecules will take part in facilitated diffusion. These molecules need the help of transport proteins that span the membrane. They can move passively along their concentration gradients, but are simply provided a passage across the membrane. Osmosis is the diffusion of free water across a selectively permeable membrane. In general, water will move from solutions with a low solute concentration, or ones that are hypotonic to it, to solutions of high solute concentration, or ones that are hypertonic to it. Now let's talk about active transport, which requires energy. Endocytosis is the bulk transport of materials into the cell with the use of energy. Using energy derived from ATP, substances like ions are able to move against their concentration gradients. When they enter the cell, the plasma membrane forms vesicles around these materials. There are three types of endocytosis: phagocytosis, pinocytosis, and receptor-mediated endocytosis. In phagocytosis, or cell eating, the cell envelops a particle by wrapping pseudopodia around it and forming a food vacuole. In pinocytosis, or cell drinking, the cell continuously gulps droplets of extracellular fluid into tiny vesicles. Receptor-mediated endocytosis is basically a specialized type of pinocytosis that allows the cell to take in very specific particles by having them bind to the protein receptor sites. Exocytosis is essentially the opposite process of endocytosis and gets substances out of the cell using energy. Transport vesicles filled with particles travel through the cell toward the plasma membrane and fuse with it, releasing their contents. Lastly, to sum up everything we have discussed, let's talk about the movement of oxygen, water, and glucose across the cell membrane. Oxygen enters and exits cells by passive transport. It diffuses along its concentration gradient without the use of energy. Water also crosses the cell membrane by passive transport. The fastest way for it to diffuse along its concentration gradient is through channel proteins called aquaporins. This would be an example of facilitated diffusion. Glucose enters cells by passive transport. Due to its need for facilitated diffusion, transport proteins move it easily past the plasma membrane. Now, if you'd like to review all of these concepts, just work on this crossword puzzle.